The sharks came at night. After 4 days floating in the Pacific, only 317 of us were left alive. I watched my best friends disappear one by one into the dark water, and I knew the atomic bomb we delivered was supposed to end the war, but for us it was just the beginning of hell. These horrific words were written by 22-year-old seaman Charles McKissick, a survivor of the USS Indianapolis disaster on the 4th night adrift in the Pacific Ocean. His hands were burned raw from salt water, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes nearly blinded by the merciless sun. But the real terror began when darkness fell. That's when the sharks came hunting. What Charles experienced wasn't just a maritime disaster. It was the final tragic chapter of America's most secret military operation. The USS Indianapolis had just completed the most important cargo delivery in human history, transporting components of the atomic bomb that would eventually end World War II. But the very secrecy that made their mission so crucial would also seal the fate of 879 American sailors who found themselves forgotten in shark-infested waters for 4 agonizing days and nights. Today you'll hear the complete story of the USS Indianapolis through the eyes of survivors like Charles, whose diary was discovered in 1968, 23 years after the disaster. His water-stained pages reveal not just the horror of the shark attacks, but the crushing irony that the men who helped end the bloodiest war in history were themselves abandoned to die in the most brutal way imaginable. If these untold stories of courage and sacrifice move you, please subscribe to our channel for more forgotten tales from history's darkest moments. On July 16, 1945, as dawn broke over the naval base at Mare Island, California, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis prepared for what would become the most classified mission of World War II. At 610 feet long and displacing nearly 10,000 tons, she was one of the Navy's finest warships, having served with distinction throughout the Pacific campaign. But this voyage would be different from any other. The Indianapolis was about to transport the most deadly cargo ever created by human hands. Charles McKissick stood on the deck that morning, watching as a mysterious wooden crate was carefully loaded aboard under heavy guard. The young seaman from Tennessee had joined the Navy 2 years earlier, driven by patriotic fervor and a desire to escape the poverty of his rural hometown. Like most of the 1,196 officers and enlisted men aboard the Indianapolis, he had no idea what they were carrying, only that it was classified at the highest possible level. Even Captain Charles McVay III, the ship's commanding officer, knew only that their cargo was vital to ending the war and that failure was not an option. The wooden crate and its accompanying lead bucket contained components of Little Boy, the uranium-based atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima just 3 weeks later. The uranium-235, enriched at enormous cost and effort in top-secret facilities across America, represented the culmination of the Manhattan Project, humanity's first attempt to harness the power of the atom for warfare. The responsibility for transporting this world-changing weapon fell to the Indianapolis and her crew, men who understood the weight of their mission even if they didn't know its exact nature. As the ship slipped her moorings and headed out into San Francisco Bay, Charles wrote in his diary about the unusual atmosphere aboard. The crew sensed that this was no ordinary deployment. The heightened security, the mysterious cargo, and the urgent timeline all suggested something momentous was about to unfold. "We're carrying something important," he noted, "something that might change everything." His words would prove more prophetic than he could have imagined, though not in the way anyone expected. The voyage to Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands was conducted at maximum speed, with the Indianapolis racing across the Pacific at nearly 30 knots. For 10 days, the ship cut through the waves under radio silence, her crew aware that they were part of something historic but unable to discuss it even among themselves. The weight of secrecy pressed down on everyone aboard, from the senior officers to the youngest seamen. Charles noted the tension in his diary, writing that even the usual card games and jokes seem forced. "We all know we're carrying something that could win the war." On July 26, 1945, the USS Indianapolis arrived at Tinian Island and successfully delivered her precious cargo to the Army Air Force's personnel waiting on the dock. The wooden crate and lead bucket were carefully unloaded under heavy security and transported to a heavily guarded compound where scientists and technicians were making final preparations for the atomic mission. For the crew of the Indianapolis, the relief was palpable. They had successfully completed the most important delivery in military history without incident or compromise, but their celebration would be short-lived. Captain McVeigh received new orders that would take his ship directly into harm's way. The Indianapolis was to proceed to Guam for a brief stop, then continue to Leyte in the Philippines, where she would join Task Force 95 in preparation for the planned invasion of Japan. What the crew didn't know was that their ship would be traveling alone, without escort, through waters prowled by Japanese submarines making their final desperate attempts to inflict damage on American forces. Charles McKissick felt a mixture of pride and anxiety as the Indianapolis departed Tinian on July 28th. In his diary, he wrote about the crew's mood following their successful mission. "We did it. Whatever we were carrying is now where it needs to be. The older guys say this might be the thing that ends the war without us having to invade Japan. I hope they're right." His optimism was shared by many aboard the ship, men who believed that their dangerous mission might have saved countless American lives by avoiding a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands. The Indianapolis made a brief stop at Guam to refuel and take on supplies, but the layover was cut short when new intelligence suggested that Japanese submarine activity in the area was increasing. Captain McVeigh was eager to reach the relative safety of Leyte, where his ship could join the protection of a larger task force. The decision to depart Guam ahead of schedule would prove fateful. It meant that the Indianapolis would be crossing some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific during the dark hours when submarines preferred to strike. As the ship left Guam behind and headed into the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea, Charles noted a change in the atmosphere aboard. The relief of completing their secret mission was being replaced by a growing sense of vulnerability. Without escort vessels or air cover, the Indianapolis was essentially alone in enemy-controlled waters, dependent entirely on speed and luck to reach her destination safely. The crew went about their duties with professional efficiency, but beneath the surface, everyone understood that they were now in extreme danger. What made their situation even more perilous was the breakdown in communication that had occurred at higher levels of command. Due to the classified nature of their recent mission, the Indianapolis was operating under special orders that kept her movements secret from many who needed to know. When the ship failed to arrive at Leyte on schedule, nobody immediately realized she was missing. The very secrecy that had protected their atomic cargo delivery would now prevent anyone from looking for them when disaster struck. The evening of July 29th found the Indianapolis steaming through calm seas under a starlit sky. Most of the crew had settled in for the night, with only the essential watchstanders remaining at their posts. Charles had just finished writing in his diary, noting that they expected to reach Leyte the following afternoon. As he prepared for sleep in his hammock, he had no way of knowing that a Japanese submarine was already tracking their ship, its commander preparing to fire the torpedoes that would send the Indianapolis to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. At exactly 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, 1945, 2 torpedoes fired by the Japanese submarine R-58 struck the USS Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first torpedo hit near the forward magazines, causing a massive explosion that lifted the bow section completely out of the water. The second torpedo struck amidships, flooding the engine rooms and knocking out all electrical power. In the span of 12 minutes, one of the Navy's finest cruisers would slip beneath the Pacific waves, taking approximately 300 men down with her and leaving 879 others fighting for their lives in shark-infested waters. Charles McKissick was thrown from his hammock by the first explosion. His world suddenly transformed into chaos and terror. The ship lurched violently to starboard as seawater poured through the massive breach in her hull, and the lights went out, plunging the interior compartments into absolute darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on briefly, then failed, leaving the crew to navigate by feel through passageways that were rapidly filling with water and oil. The sound was indescribable. The groaning of tortured steel, the rush of incoming water, and above all, the screams of men trapped in flooding compartments. What made the sinking so catastrophic was the Indianapolis's design and the location of the torpedo hits. The first torpedo detonated near the ship's magazines, causing secondary explosions that obliterated her forward superstructure and killed hundreds of men instantly. The second torpedo struck the engine rooms, flooding them so quickly that the engineers on duty had no chance to escape. The combination of these hits caused the ship to develop such a severe list that many of her life rafts and boats could not be launched, leaving most of the crew with nothing but life jackets for survival. Captain McVeigh, awakened by the explosions, immediately ordered abandon ship, but the command could barely be heard over the din of escaping steam and rushing water. Many sailors never received the order at all, trapped in compartments below decks or stunned by the violence of the explosions. Those who did make it topside found themselves on a ship that was sinking so rapidly that there was no time for orderly evacuation procedures. Men jumped overboard in their underwear, many without life jackets, as the Indianapolis tilted further and further to starboard. Charles managed to reach the main deck just as the ship was taking her final plunge. In his diary, he later wrote about the surreal horror of those final moments. The Indianapolis was standing almost vertical, her propellers spinning uselessly in the air. Men were sliding down the deck into the water, and I could hear the screams of those still trapped inside. I jumped as far as I could from the ship, knowing that the suction would try to pull me down with her. His description matches those of other survivors, all of whom remembered the terrible sight of their ship disappearing beneath the waves, taking with them her everything they owned and many of their closest friends. The actual sinking took just 12 minutes from the first torpedo hit to the moment when the Indianapolis's stern disappeared beneath the surface. For the men in the water, however, the nightmare was just beginning. As they watched their ship vanish into the depths, they found themselves scattered across miles of ocean with minimal survival equipment and no way to communicate their location to rescue forces. Most were wearing life jackets, but many of these were damaged or inadequate for prolonged survival in the open ocean. Worse still, they were floating in waters known to contain some of the largest concentrations of sharks in the Pacific. The immediate aftermath of the sinking was characterized by confusion and disbelief. Many survivors initially assumed that rescue vessels were already on their way, that the distress signals had been received and help would arrive within hours. They had no way of knowing that the Indianapolis had been operating under such secrecy that no one would realize she was missing for days. As dawn broke on July 30th, revealing groups of oil-covered men scattered across the empty ocean, the full magnitude of their situation began to sink in. They were alone in the vast Pacific with no rescue in sight and no idea how long they would have to survive on their own. As the tropical sun climbed higher on July 30th, the survivors of the USS Indianapolis faced their first full day in the shark-infested waters of the Philippine Sea. What had begun as a fight for survival was about to transform into something far worse, a prolonged nightmare that would test the limits of human endurance and reveal the ocean's most terrifying predators in their natural element. The men who had successfully delivered the atomic bomb components that would end World War II now found themselves at the mercy of creatures that recognized no flag or nation, only the scent of blood in the water. Charles McKissick found himself in a group of about 40 survivors, all clinging to debris from their sunken ship or floating in life jackets that we were already beginning to chafe their skin raw. The initial shock of the sinking was giving way to more immediate concerns. The burning heat of the Pacific sun, the salt water that stung every cut and scrape, and the growing thirst that would soon become unbearable. But it was the dark shapes circling beneath them that filled the survivors with a primal fear that went beyond anything they had experienced in combat. Did you know that the waters around the USS Indianapolis disaster site contained one of the highest concentrations of oceanic white-tip sharks in the Pacific? These apex predators, some measuring over 12 feet in length, had been drawn to the area by the massive oil slick and debris field left by the sinking ship. The sharks that prowled these waters were primarily oceanic whitetips, massive predators perfectly adapted for life in the open ocean. Unlike their coastal cousins, these sharks were bold and aggressive, unafraid of humans and perfectly capable of attacking healthy, swimming prey. They were drawn not just by the blood of wounded survivors, but by the noise, movement, and electromagnetic fields generated by hundreds of men struggling in the water. What the survivors didn't realize was that they had fallen into an environment where humans were no longer at the top of the food chain. The first shark attacks began on the morning of July 30th, less than 12 hours after the sinking. Charles wrote in his waterproof diary about the horror of watching a shipmate simply disappear beneath the surface, pulled down by something unseen in the dark water below. Tommy was floating right next to me talking about his girl back home, and then suddenly he was just gone. No scream, no splash, just gone. The water turned red where he had been, and I knew what was down there waiting for the rest of us. His matter-of-fact description masked a terror that would haunt every survivor for the rest of their lives. What made the shark attacks so terrifying was their unpredictability. The survivors quickly learned that the sharks preferred to attack from below, striking their victims with such force that they were often pulled underwater before they could cry out. Some men simply vanished without a trace, while others were mortally wounded and left to bleed out in the water, their injuries attracting even more predators. The psychological impact was devastating. Every splash, every shadow, every piece of floating debris could signal the approach of death from below. As the first day stretched into night, the survivors began to understand the full scope of their predicament. The sharks were most active during the early morning and evening hours, when the changing light conditions gave them a tactical advantage over their human prey. But even during the heat of the day, when the predators retreated to deeper water, the survivors faced other enemies: dehydration, sun exposure, and the gradual failure of their life-saving equipment. Many life jackets were damaged or waterlogged, forcing men to swim constantly to stay afloat, exhausting their strength and making them more vulnerable to shark attack. By the second night, Charles noted that the groups of survivors were becoming smaller and more scattered. Some men had been taken by sharks, others had simply disappeared during the night, either drowning from exhaustion or swimming away in delirium brought on by dehydration and exposure. The strongest survivors tried to maintain group cohesion, knowing that their chances of rescue were better if they stayed together. But the ocean seemed determined to separate them, scattering the groups across miles of empty water. The third day brought new horrors as hallucinations began to afflict the most severely dehydrated survivors. Men who had been rational and coherent just hours earlier suddenly began seeing islands on the horizon, or rescue ships that existed only in their minds. Some swam away from their groups, convinced they were heading for safety, only to disappear forever into the vast Pacific. Others began drinking seawater despite warnings from their shipmates, accelerating their descent into madness and death. Charles managed to maintain his sanity by focusing on documenting their ordeal in his diary, writing in short bursts when conditions allowed. His entries from the third day reveal the psychological toll of prolonged exposure and constant fear. The sharks are always there now. Even when we can't see them, we know they're watching, waiting. Some of the guys have given up. They just float there with their eyes closed, waiting to die. I keep thinking about home, about the letters I never sent, about all the things I wanted to do after the war. His words capture the desperate mental struggle that accompanied the physical battle for survival. On August 2nd, 1945, after 4 days and 5 nights of unimaginable horror, salvation finally arrived in the form of a routine patrol aircraft that just happened to be flying over the disaster site. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, piloting a PV-1 Ventura bomber on an anti-submarine patrol, spotted what he initially thought was an oil slick from a Japanese submarine. As he flew lower to investigate, he made a discovery that would shock the entire Pacific Fleet. Hundreds of American sailors scattered across miles of ocean, desperately waving at his aircraft with the last of their strength. Charles McKissick was barely conscious when he heard the sound of aircraft engines overhead. By this point, only 317 of the original 879 survivors remained alive, the rest having succumbed to shark attacks, drowning, dehydration, or exposure. Those who were still alive were in critical condition, their bodies ravaged by days of sun exposure, saltwater immersion, and the psychological trauma of constant terror. Many had given up hope of rescue entirely, resigned to dying in the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. The discovery of the Indianapolis survivors set off the largest air-sea rescue operation in Pacific Fleet history. Within hours of Lieutenant Gwynn's radio report, dozens of aircraft were converging on the disaster site, dropping life rafts, medical supplies, and survival equipment to the scattered groups of survivors. The destroyer USS Cecil Doyle was the first rescue vessel to arrive on scene, followed by several other ships that worked through the night to pull the remaining survivors from the water. What the rescue teams found was almost beyond description. Men who had been strong, healthy sailors just 4 days earlier were now barely recognizable human beings, their bodies burned raw by the sun, their minds shattered by prolonged trauma. Many survivors were delirious, some couldn't stop screaming, and others had simply withdrawn into catatonic silence. The medical personnel aboard the rescue ships worked frantically to save lives, but for many survivors, the physical and psychological damage was already too severe to fully repair. Charles was among the lucky ones pulled from the water by the USS Doyle in the early morning hours of August 3rd. In his final diary entry, written weeks later in a hospital bed, he described the moment of rescue. "When they pulled me onto the ship, I couldn't believe it was real. I kept waiting to wake up back in the water with the sharks. The sailors who saved us looked at us like we were ghosts, and maybe we were. We had seen things that no human should ever have to see, survived things that should have killed us all." His description captures the profound psychological impact of the ordeal on both survivors and rescuers. The Indianapolis disaster had claimed 879 lives, making it the worst single loss of life at sea in U.S. Navy history. Of the 1,196 men aboard when the ship was torpedoed, only 317 survived to be rescued. The shark attacks alone were responsible for an estimated 150 deaths, though the exact number would never be known. The survivors faced months or even years of physical and psychological rehabilitation, and many would never fully recover from their ordeal in the shark-infested waters of the Pacific. Perhaps most tragic of all was the realization that the disaster could have been prevented. The Indianapolis had been traveling alone without escort through waters known to contain enemy submarines. Communication failures meant that no one realized the ship was overdue until days after she was supposed to arrive. The very secrecy that had protected their atomic bomb delivery mission had also prevented anyone from mounting a timely rescue operation when the ship was lost. In the end, the men who had helped end the bloodiest war in human history paid the ultimate price for their service to their country. 23 years after the USS Indianapolis disaster, in 1968, Charles McKissick's waterproof diary was discovered among his personal effects following his death from cancer at the age of 45. His family had known that he was a survivor of the Indianapolis, but Charles had rarely spoken about his experience, carrying the psychological scars of those 4 days in shark-infested waters for the rest of his life. The diary, written in pencil on pages that had somehow survived both the salt water and the passage of time, provided one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the disaster ever recovered. What makes Charles's diary so remarkable isn't just its survival, but the clarity and honesty with which he documented one of the most horrific ordeals in naval history. His entries reveal not just the physical aspects of survival, the shark attacks, the dehydration, the equipment failures, but also the psychological journey of men pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. His words provide insight into how ordinary sailors found the courage to continue fighting for life even when death seemed inevitable, and how the bonds of brotherhood forged in combat sustained them through their darkest hours. The publication of Charles's diary in the 1970s helped bring new attention to the Indianapolis disaster, which had been largely overlooked by the public in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Japan's surrender had overshadowed the tragedy of the ship that delivered the bomb components, and many Americans were unaware of the sacrifice made by the Indianapolis crew. The diary helped humanize the statistics, putting faces and names to the casualty figures and showing the world what these men had endured. The Indianapolis disaster also led to significant changes in U.S. Navy procedures and policies. New communication protocols were established to prevent ships from disappearing without anyone noticing, and escort requirements were strengthened for vessels operating in dangerous waters. Search and rescue procedures were improved based on lessons learned from the delayed discovery of the survivors, and medical protocols for treating exposure and trauma victims were updated to reflect the experiences of the Indianapolis survivors. Perhaps most importantly, the disaster highlighted the incredible courage and resilience of ordinary American servicemen under extraordinary circumstances. The survivors of the Indianapolis didn't just endure 4 days of horror. They maintained their humanity, helped their shipmates, and refused to give up hope even when their situation seemed hopeless. Their story became a testament to the power of the human spirit and the bonds that unite men in combat, transcending the specific circumstances of their ordeal to become a universal story of survival and sacrifice. What do you think enabled these men to survive such an unimaginable ordeal? Was it their naval training, their faith, or simply the determination to return home to their loved ones? Today, the USS Indianapolis is remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a symbol of the hidden costs of victory in World War II. The ship and her crew played a crucial role in ending the bloodiest conflict in human history, delivering the components of the atomic bomb that would ultimately save countless lives by making the invasion of Japan unnecessary. But their success came at a terrible price. 879 American sailors paid with their lives for the privilege of serving their country in its darkest hour. The wreck of the USS Indianapolis was finally located in 2016, lying on the floor of the Pacific Ocean at a depth of over 18,000 feet. The discovery brought closure to many families who had waited over 70 years to learn the final resting place of their loved ones. But for those who survived, like Charles McKissick and his fellow Indianapolis veterans, the ocean had already given up its most important treasure, the story of courage, sacrifice, and survival that continues to inspire new generations of Americans. Charles McKissick died believing that his story would die with him, never knowing that his diary would survive to tell the world about the worst disaster in U.S. Navy history. His final entry, written months after his rescue, concluded with these words: "We delivered the bomb that ended the war, but we paid a price that no victory can justify. The sharks took our bodies, but they couldn't take our souls. We were Indianapolis, and we survived because we had to, because someone had to tell the world what happened in those waters and what it cost to win the peace." His legacy lives on in every person who reads his words and remembers the sacrifice of the USS Indianapolis.